Human mechanic fixed the crying fledgling's toy, unaware the alpha vampire was watching. The old brass gears clicked their final rotation as Mara Sullivan wiped her grease-stained hands on her work apron. Another 16-hour day at Sullivan's Mechanical Repairs was finally over. The dim glow from her workshop's single overhead bulb cast long shadows across scattered clockwork parts, steam pipes, and half-assembled contraptions that kept the human district running. Outside, the city of New Salem had settled into its uneasy twilight, that dangerous hour when decent folk hurried home and the night belonged to them. The vampires. Mara had learned long ago to keep her head down and her workshop locked tight after sunset. 26 years of life in the divided city had taught her that survival meant staying invisible, especially for a blue-collar mechanic in the human quarter, where hope was as scarce as steady work. She was reaching for the heavy iron deadbolt when a sound pierced the night air. A child's terrified wailing that made her blood run cold. No, 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 she thought, her hand freezing on the lock. Don't get involved. Lock the door. Pretend you didn't hear anything. But the crying grew louder, more desperate, echoing off the narrow brick walls of Copper Street. It was the sound of pure terror, the kind that reached into your chest and squeezed your heart until you couldn't breathe. Mara cursed under her breath and yanked the door open. The scene that greeted her was like something from a nightmare. A small figure, barely more than a child, stumbled down the cobblestone street, pale as moonlight and shaking like a leaf in a hurricane. The kid couldn't have been more than 7 or 8, with platinum hair that seemed to glow in the darkness and clothes that looked expensive even when torn and dirty. But what made Mara's breath catch wasn't the child's otherworldly appearance. It was what the kid was clutching against their chest. A mechanical toy that had clearly seen better days. Gears hung loose, springs had snapped, and one of the tiny brass wings was barely attached. A vampire child, Mara realized with growing horror. A fledgling. Please, the child sobbed, looking directly at her with eyes that were too old for such a young face. Please, it's broken. I can't make it work anymore. Before Mara could respond, the sound of heavy boots echoed from the shadows behind the child. 2 massive figures emerged from the darkness between buildings, vampire guards in black leather, their eyes glowing red in the dim light. Even from 50 feet away, Mara could see the fangs glinting as they spoke. The air went this way, one growled, his voice carrying easily through the night air. Lord Silas will have our heads if we don't find the little brat soon. Should never have run off during the blood moon ceremony, the second guard snarled. Spoiled little prince thinks they can just wander into human territory whenever they please. The child whimpered and looked back over their shoulder, terror written across their delicate features. Without thinking, Mara stepped forward and grabbed the fledgling's hand. In here, she whispered urgently, pulling them into her workshop. Quickly now. She slammed the door shut and threw the deadbolt, her heart hammering against her ribs. Through the grimy window, she watched the guard silhouettes prowl past, their voices growing fainter as they continued down the street. They're looking for you, Mara said quietly, turning to face the child who was now huddled in the corner, still clutching the broken toy. The fledgling nodded, tears streaming down their pale cheeks. I just wanted to see the human district. Everyone always says how dangerous you are, but you seem. They paused, searching for words. You seem sad like me. Mara felt something twist in her chest. She knelt down to the child's level, noting how their clothes, silk and velvet, screamed of vampire nobility. This wasn't just any fledgling. This was someone important. What's your name, sweetie? Ember, the child whispered. And this is Mr. Clockwork. They held up the broken mechanical toy, a small brass bird with intricate gears visible through its transparent chest. My birth father made it for me before the other vampires made him disappear. It used to sing lullabies, but now it won't work anymore. Mara's throat tightened. Politics and bloodlines were complicated in vampire society. She'd heard enough whispered stories to know that much. But looking at this scared, lonely child, she didn't see a dangerous predator. She saw a kid who missed their parent and wanted their favorite toy fixed. "Let me take a look," Mara said gently, accepting the delicate mechanism. Her experienced fingers immediately identified the problems: a disconnected gear train, a broken spring mechanism, and a loose wire that controlled the sound box. "I think I can help Mr. Clockwork feel better." Working by lamplight, she carefully disassembled the toy, her steady hands making quick work of the repairs. Ember watched in fascination as Mara cleaned each gear, replaced the broken spring with one from her spare parts collection, and reconnected the tiny wires with surgical precision. "There," she said finally, winding a small key on the bird's back. "Let's see if he remembers how to sing." The mechanical bird came to life with a soft whirring sound. Its brass wings began to flutter, its tiny head turned from side to side, and then, a gentle melody filled the workshop. It was hauntingly beautiful, nothing like the harsh industrial sounds Mara was used to hearing. Ember's face transformed with joy. For the first time since running into the shop, they smiled, and Mara was struck by how human that smile looked. "Thank you," Ember whispered, hugging the toy close. "Thank you so much. You're the first person who's ever been kind to me just because you wanted to be." Heavy footsteps echoed outside again, closer this time. Both guards had returned, and they were moving slowly, methodically checking every door and window. "Hide," Mara breathed, pointing to a large storage cabinet. "Whatever happens, don't come out until I tell you it's safe." Ember nodded and scrambled into the cabinet, Mr. Clockwork still singing softly in their arms. The footsteps paused right outside Mara's door. As she stood there in the silence, waiting to see if she just signed her own death warrant, one thought kept running through her head. "I just helped a vampire heir escape. I just interfered with vampire politics. God help me, what have I done?" The guards' voices grew distant once more, and Mara let out a shaky breath. She'd managed to keep the child safe for now, but she had no idea that her simple act of kindness had just changed the course of both their lives forever. 24 hours later, Mara was beginning to think she might actually survive her moment of stupidity. She'd spent the entire day jumping at every sound, expecting vampire enforcers to break down her door at any moment. But as evening approached and her workshop remained untouched, she started to hope that maybe, just maybe, little Ember had made it home safely without anyone discovering who had helped them. She was dead wrong. At exactly 9:47 p.m., her world exploded. The reinforced steel door of her workshop didn't just open. It disintegrated. The entire frame ripped away from the brick wall as if it were made of paper, sending chunks of metal and mortar flying across the room. Mara dove behind her workbench as debris rained down around her, her ears ringing from the thunderous crash. Through the settling dust she saw them. A dozen vampire warriors in midnight black tactical gear, their eyes glowing like red coals in the darkness. They moved with inhuman speed and precision, fanning out to surround her hiding spot before she could even think about running. But it wasn't the soldiers that made every human on Copper Street slam their shutters closed and lock their doors. It was him. Lord Silas Blackthorne stepped through the ruined doorway like death incarnate. He was tall, easily 6.5 feet, with shoulder-length black hair and pale skin that seemed to absorb the light around him. His expensive black coat billowed in the night wind, and the silver pins on his collar marked him as Alpha of the Northern Coven. Mara had never seen him in person before, but she'd heard the stories. Silas Blackthorne was old. Some said 300 years, others claimed twice that. He'd built his power through cunning and ruthless violence, eliminating rivals and crushing rebellions with equal efficiency. Even other vampires feared him. And now he was standing in her workshop, radiating the kind of raw predatory energy that made every human instinct scream run. "Where is she?" His voice was like velvet wrapped around steel, beautiful and terrifying at the same time. When he spoke, even his own guards seemed to hold their breath. Mara stayed crouched behind her workbench, her heart hammering so hard she was sure everyone in the room could hear it. Through a gap in the scattered tools, She could see his polished black boots as he moved closer. "I can smell you, little human," Silas continued, his tone almost conversational. "There's no point hiding. I know someone in this district touched what belongs to me." The silence stretched on for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds. Mara closed her eyes and tried to think. Maybe if she stayed quiet long enough, he'd give up and leave. Maybe. "Bring me everyone on this street," Silas ordered his guards. "Every man, woman, and child. If no one confesses, we'll start with the youngest and work our way up." No. The word hit Mara like a physical blow. She thought about Mrs. Chen next door with her twin toddlers. About old Mr. Rodriguez who could barely walk anymore. About all the innocent people who would die because she'd been too soft-hearted to turn away a scared child. Before she could lose her nerve, Mara stood up. "It was me." The words came out steadier than she'd expected, though her legs were shaking so badly she had to grip the workbench for support. Every vampire in the room turned to stare at her, but she only had eyes for Silas. Close, he was even more terrifying. His face was sharp angles and perfect features that belonged in a Renaissance painting, but his eyes were the deep red of fresh blood, and they seemed to look straight through her soul. "You." Silas moved toward her with that fluid vampire grace, stopping just close enough that she could feel the unnatural cold radiating from his skin. "You're the one who dared touch my heir." Mara lifted her chin, surprised by her own defiance. "Your heir was scared and alone. They needed help." Something flickered across Silas's features, surprise, maybe, or confusion. "And you thought it wise to interfere with vampire business?" "I thought it was wise to help a frightened child." Mara shot back, her fear transforming into anger. "If that's a crime worth dying for, then go ahead and kill me. But don't you dare hurt my neighbors for something I did." The workshop went dead silent. Even the night sounds from the street seemed to fade away. Silas studied her face for a long moment, his red eyes unreadable. Then, to everyone's complete shock, he dropped to one knee in front of her. "Thank you," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the sudden hush. "You showed kindness to my child when you had every reason to turn them away. You risked your life for someone you didn't even know." Mara's mouth fell open. Around the room, she could see the vampire guards exchanging bewildered looks. Outside, she heard the distant sound of window shutters cracking open as curious humans tried to process what they were witnessing. The most feared vampire in New Salem was kneeling before a human mechanic. In public. In front of witnesses. Mara stammered, completely lost. "I don't understand." Silas rose gracefully to his feet, but the damage was already done. The image was burned into everyone's memory. The alpha vampire showing respect to a human woman. "Ember told me what you did," he said quietly. "How you fixed their toy. How you comforted them. How you hid them from my guards even though you knew it could mean your death." His red eyes seemed to glow brighter. "That kind of courage deserves recognition." Before Mara could respond, he turned to address his guards, and by extension the entire district that was undoubtedly listening. "Let it be known that this human is under my protection," Silas announced, his voice carrying absolute authority. "She showed mercy to mine. Any who harm her answer to me personally." With that, he strode toward the ruined doorway. But at the threshold, he paused and looked back at her one more time. "Be careful, Miss Sullivan," he said, and there was something almost gentle in his tone. "You've just made yourself very interesting to some very dangerous people." Then he was gone, taking his guards with him and leaving Mara alone in her destroyed workshop, wondering what the hell had just happened to her life. The first sign of trouble came at dawn. Mara was sweeping glass and debris from her workshop floor when she noticed the silence. Copper Street was always bustling by 7 a.m. Vendors setting up their stalls, children running to school, the steady hum of working-class life beginning another day. Instead, she found empty sidewalks and shuttered windows. Even Mrs. Chen's fruit cart, which had occupied the same corner for 15 years, was nowhere to be seen. The second sign came when she tried to open her bank account to pay for door repairs. "I'm sorry, Miss Sullivan," the nervous clerk stammered, avoiding her eyes. "Your account has been flagged. Federal Vampire Affairs Division has frozen all transactions pending investigation." Mara stared at him in disbelief. "Investigation for what?" "Suspected collaboration with hostile supernatural entities," he whispered, sliding a formal notice across the counter with shaking hands. "You're required to report to the FVAD office immediately." By noon, Mara was sitting in a windowless interrogation room, facing two stone-faced agents who looked like they'd stepped straight out of a government nightmare. Agent Morrison was a tall, thin man with dead eyes and a permanent scowl. His partner, Agent Kelly, was younger but somehow seemed even more dangerous, the kind of person who smiled while delivering threats. "Let's start simple," Morrison said, flipping through a thick file with her name on it. "How long have you been working as a vampire sympathizer?" "I'm not," Mara began. "3 witnesses saw the alpha vampire kneel before you," Kelly interrupted smoothly. "That's not normal behavior, Miss Sullivan. Vampires don't show respect to humans unless there's a very good reason." "He was thanking me for helping his child," Mara said, trying to keep her voice steady. "That's all." Morrison laughed. A harsh, bitter sound. "His child? You mean the heir to the most powerful vampire coven in the region? The same heir whose bloodline goes back for centuries." He leaned forward, his eyes glittering with malice. "And you expect us to believe you just happened to help them out of the goodness of your heart?" "Yes," Mara said firmly, "because that's exactly what happened." The interrogation continued for 6 hours. The same questions over and over, delivered with increasing hostility. They wanted to know about secret meetings that never happened, about payments she'd never received, about plans she'd never made. By the time they released her with a warning to stay available for further questioning, the sun was setting and Mara's entire life had changed. Her workshop stood empty except for a handful of cancelled order notices that had been shoved under the broken door. Mrs. Patterson had reclaimed her grandfather clock with a note saying she couldn't risk associating with vampire collaborators. The Hendersons wanted their deposit back for the steam engine repair. Even old Mr. Rodriguez, who'd been bringing her broken gadgets for years, had sent his grandson to collect his pocket watch rather than face her himself. But the real blow came from an unexpected source. Mara Sullivan. She turned to find 3 figures standing in the shadows of the alley behind her shop. Vampires, but not the elite guard she'd seen with Silas. These were different, older, more refined, with the kind of cold beauty that spoke of ancient bloodlines and centuries of power. The leader was a woman with silver hair and eyes like winter frost. Her companions flanked her like predators, their fangs already extended in anticipation. Lady Evangeline Ashworth, the silver-haired vampire, introduced herself with mock courtesy. "Inner circle of the Northern Coven. We need to talk." Mara's blood turned to ice. The inner circle, Silas's advisors and the most powerful vampires in the region after the Alpha himself. "You've caused quite a stir, little human," Lady Evangeline continued, circling Mara like a shark. "Did you really think you could touch our heir without consequences?" "I helped a scared child," Mara said, hating how her voice shook. "Nothing more. Nothing more." One of the male vampires, pale as death with black veins visible under his translucent skin, bared his fangs in a snarl. "You contaminated pure vampire blood with your human stench. You polluted a bloodline that has remained untainted for 400 years. Lady Evangeline raised a delicate hand, silencing her companion. "What Lord Matthias means," she said with poisonous sweetness, "is that your intervention has created certain complications." "Such as?" Mara asked, though she was pretty sure she didn't want to know the answer. "Such as our Alpha showing interest in a human woman," Lady Evangeline replied, her frost blue eyes narrowing. Such as him declaring you under his protection in front of witnesses. Such as him potentially compromising centuries of vampire superiority for the sake of some misguided gratitude. The third vampire, a woman with red hair and gold eyes, stepped closer. Silas has always been emotional about his heir. We hoped time would cure him of this weakness, but your interference has made things worse. I don't understand, Mara said, though a terrible suspicion was beginning to form in her mind. Don't you? Lady Evangeline smiled, and it was the most terrifying expression Mara had ever seen. He's been watching you, little human. Our spies report he's been ensuring your safety, making sure you have supplies, arranging for your debts to disappear. He thinks we don't know, but we see everything. Mara felt the world tilt beneath her feet. He's been. What? The Alpha is becoming attached to you, Lord Matthias spat. And that makes you a threat to everything we've built. Lady Evangeline nodded gravely. So you understand our dilemma. We can't simply kill you, not without risking Silas's wrath. But we can't allow this fascination to continue. What do you want from me? Mara whispered. Leave, Lady Evangeline said simply. Disappear from New Salem. Tonight. If you truly care about that child, you'll remove yourself from their life before your human weakness destroys everything they're meant to inherit. The vampires melted back into the shadows as suddenly as they'd appeared, leaving Mara alone with the weight of their threat hanging in the air. As she stood there in the gathering darkness, surrounded by the ruins of her old life, Mara realized with growing horror that her simple act of kindness had trapped her in a web of vampire politics she couldn't possibly understand. And somewhere in the night, she had the uncomfortable feeling that she was being watched. 3 days after the Inner Circle's threat, Mara was seriously considering taking their advice and disappearing into the night. Her savings were nearly gone, her workshop remained empty of customers, and every shadow seemed to hide potential enemies. She was packing the few belongings she couldn't bear to leave behind when she heard a familiar sound drifting through the broken doorframe, the gentle melody of Mr. Clockwork's lullaby. Kind lady, a small voice called from the darkness outside. Are you still here? Mara's heart clenched. Ember. The fledgling appeared in the doorway, clutching their mechanical bird and looking around nervously. In the dim light, Mara could see they were dressed in simpler clothes tonight, dark pants and a hooded jacket that made them look more like a human child than vampire nobility. I wasn't supposed to come, Ember whispered, stepping into the workshop. But I heard the other vampires talking. They said you might go away because of me. Mara knelt down to the child's level, her throat tight with emotion. Oh, sweetie, this isn't your fault. Yes, it is, Ember said, tears glittering in their 2 old eyes. Everything bad happens because of me. My birth father disappeared because he loved me too much. Now you're in trouble because you were nice to me. They clutched Mr. Clockwork tighter. Maybe I really am cursed. Without thinking, Mara pulled the child into a gentle embrace. Ember was cold. All vampires ran cold. But they fit perfectly against her shoulder, small and fragile and desperately in need of comfort. You are not cursed, Mara said firmly. You're a sweet, brave child who deserves kindness. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Ember buried their face against her neck, and Mara felt wetness that might have been tears. For several minutes they stayed like that, a human woman and a vampire heir, finding solace in each other's company while the dangerous world waited outside. Neither of them noticed the tall figure standing motionless in the shadows across the street. Silas had been watching over Mara's workshop for 3 nights, making sure the Inner Circle kept their distance while he decided what to do about the impossible situation. He'd told himself it was simple protection, repaying a debt to the woman who'd shown kindness to his heir. But watching her hold Ember with such genuine tenderness, he felt something stir in his chest that he'd thought was long dead. When was the last time anyone had touched his child with love instead of fear? When was the last time Ember had smiled without calculation or politics behind it? In 3 centuries of existence, Silas couldn't remember ever seeing such pure, uncomplicated affection. She makes the nightmares go away, Ember was saying, their voice muffled against Mara's shoulder. When I'm with the kind lady, I don't dream about blood and death anymore. Mara's hand stroked the child's platinum hair with infinite gentleness. Everyone deserves peaceful dreams, she murmured. Especially children. Something twisted painfully in Silas's chest. His own childhood, what he could remember of it, had been nothing but violence and survival. He'd assumed that was simply the vampire way, that gentleness was weakness to be eliminated. But seeing his heir relaxed and happy in human arms, he began to wonder what else he might have been wrong about. Over the following weeks, a strange routine developed. Ember would slip away from the vampire compound after midnight, when even the guards were drowsy, and spend an hour or 2 in Mara's workshop. Sometimes they just talked. Sometimes Mara would show them how her mechanical devices worked. Sometimes they would sit in comfortable silence while Mr. Clockwork played his lullabies. And always Silas watched from the shadows. He began to learn things about Mara that surprised him. She was intelligent, not just with mechanical skills, but with genuine insight into people and problems. She was brave in quiet ways, never backing down from what she believed was right even when it put her in danger. And she was lonely, though she tried to hide it behind busy work and forced smiles. One night, he decided to make his presence known. "Don't be afraid," he said softly, stepping into the pool of light from her workshop's single lamp. Mara spun around, instinctively moving to shield Ember with her body, but she didn't scream or run. "How long have you been watching us?" she asked, her voice steady despite the tremor he could hear underneath. "Long enough," Silas replied, keeping his distance. Up close, she was smaller than he'd remembered, barely reaching his shoulder, but there was steel in her spine that impressed him. "I wanted to make sure Ember was safe." "Safe from what?" "Me." There was a hint of challenge in her tone that made his lips quirk upward. "Safe from my inner circle," Silas said honestly. "There." Displeased with recent developments. Mara's jaw tightened. "They made that clear." Silas felt a surge of anger. "They threatened you directly." "They suggested I leave town for everyone's good," Mara said, lifting her chin defiantly. "Apparently, my human weakness is corrupting your heir's pure vampire nature." To her surprise, Silas laughed. A rich, genuine sound that transformed his entire face. "If what I've observed these past weeks is corruption, then perhaps we vampires could use more of it." Their eyes met across the small workshop, and something passed between them, a recognition perhaps or the first spark of understanding. "Why?" Mara asked quietly. "Why risk your people's anger to protect me?" Silas looked at Ember, who had fallen asleep curled up on an old blanket, Mr. Clockwork still playing softly in their arms. "Because," he said, his voice gentler than she'd ever heard it, "you gave my child something I never could." "What's that?" "Peace." When Mara woke the next morning, she found supplies for her workshop stacked neatly outside her door. Brass fittings, precision tools, rare clockwork components that would have cost her months of wages. There was no note, but she didn't need one. And when the debt collector who'd been harassing her for months suddenly announced that her outstanding bills had been mysteriously paid in full, she began to understand that she wasn't as alone as she'd thought. The attack came on a Tuesday night, during the darkest hour before dawn. Mara was working late again, trying to finish a complex clockwork commission that might actually pay enough to keep her fed for another week. The mysterious supply donations had helped, but she still needed legitimate income to survive. She'd been so focused on the delicate gear assembly that she almost missed the smell. Smoke. Her head snapped up from her work, nostrils flaring. It wasn't the clean scent of her workshop's coal heating system. This was acrid, chemical, the smell of accelerant and deliberate arson. The first flames licked up through the floorboards near the back wall. Oh God! Mara breathed, scrambling to her feet. The fire spread with unnatural speed, racing along what looked like pre-laid trails of fuel. This wasn't an accident. Someone had planned this. Someone wanted her dead. She grabbed her leather tool bag and rushed toward the front door, but froze when she saw the silhouettes waiting outside. 3 figures in dark clothes, their faces hidden behind masks, blocking her only escape route. Through the grimy window, she could see the glint of steel in their hands. The workshop filled with smoke as flames climbed the walls behind her. Heat pressed against her back like a living thing, and she knew she had maybe 2 minutes before the whole place became a death trap. That's when she heard the familiar melody of Mr. Clockwork cutting through the roar of flames. "Kind lady," Ember's voice called from somewhere in the smoke. "This way." Mara spun around, coughing as the toxic air burned her lungs. Through the haze she could see the small vampire child near what remained of her back wall, gesturing frantically toward a gap in the burning timber. "The old coal chute," Ember called out. "It leads to the alley. Hurry." Mara didn't hesitate. She dove through the smoke toward Ember's voice, her eyes streaming tears from the chemical burn in the air. The child grabbed her hand with surprising strength and pulled her toward a narrow opening she'd forgotten existed, a relic from when the building had been heated by coal deliveries. The metal chute was hot to the touch and barely wide enough for an adult, but it was their only chance. Ember went first, their small size making the passage easier, then turned to help guide Mara through. She scraped her shoulders and tore her pants sliding down the rusty metal, but when she tumbled out into the alley behind her building, she was alive and relatively unburned. "Thank you," she gasped, pulling Ember close. "How did you?" "I felt them coming," the child said, their young face grim with knowledge beyond their years. "Bad vampires have a different smell than good ones. I came to warn you, but I was almost too late." Through the narrow alley, they could hear the assassins realizing their prey had escaped. Heavy boots pounded around the building toward their hiding spot. "We need to run," Mara whispered, but Ember shook their head. "They're too fast. We can't outrun vampires." The child looked up at her with those 2 old eyes. "But maybe we can hide until..." The first assassin rounded the corner, moving with inhuman speed. His face was pale and gaunt, with the kind of ancient hunger that spoke of centuries spent killing. When he saw them, he smiled, revealing fangs that gleamed like ivory daggers. "Found you," he hissed, raising a wicked-looking blade. "The inner circle sends their regards, human." Mara pushed Ember behind her and raised her heavy tool bag as a pathetic shield, knowing it wouldn't make any difference. The vampire was already in motion, crossing the 20 feet between them in a heartbeat. The blade was inches from her throat when the night exploded. Silas Blackthorn materialized out of darkness like vengeance incarnate. His hand closed around the assassin's throat, and with a casual twist, he separated the vampire's head from his shoulders. Ancient blood sprayed across the alley walls as the body crumbled to dust. The second assassin tried to flee, but Silas moved faster than human eyes could follow. One moment the killer was running, the next he was screaming as Silas's claws tore through his chest and ripped out his still-beating heart. The third assassin, seeing his companions destroyed in seconds, dropped his weapon and raised his hands. "Please, Lord Silas, we were only following orders." "Whose orders?" Silas's voice was barely recognizable, a primal growl that seemed to come from the depths of hell itself. "The inner circle. They said she was corrupting you. They said..." He never finished the sentence. Silas moved like liquid shadow, and suddenly the assassin was nothing but dust blowing away on the night wind. In the sudden silence that followed, Mara became aware that windows were opening throughout the district. Dozens of human faces peered out at the scene, Silas standing over the remains of 3 dead vampires, his protective fury radiating outward like heat from a forge. He turned toward her, and she saw that his red eyes were blazing with an intensity that should have terrified her. Instead, she felt something warm and unexpected unfurl in her chest. Are you hurt? His voice was gentler now, but she could hear the barely controlled violence still simmering underneath. No, she managed, her throat dry from smoke and shock. Ember saved me. Silas looked at his heir with pride and relief, then back at Mara with something deeper, something that made her pulse quicken in ways that had nothing to do with fear. This ends now, he said, loud enough for every listening human and vampire in the district to hear. Anyone who threatens what is mine will face the same fate. What is mine? The words hung in the air like a declaration of war. As sirens wailed in the distance and her workshop burned behind them, Mara realized with crystal clarity that she was falling in love with the most dangerous vampire in New Salem. And that revelation terrified her more than any assassin ever could. The poison struck 3 days after the assassination attempt. Mara was in her temporary workshop, a converted storage room that Silas had quietly arranged for her, when Ember stumbled through the door, their face pale as moonlight and their small body trembling violently. "Kind lady," they gasped, collapsing to their knees. "I don't feel good. Everything hurts." Mara rushed to catch the child as they swayed, her heart lurching when she felt the fever burning through their cold vampire skin. Ember's platinum hair was damp with sweat, and their usual bright eyes were unfocused and glassy. "What happened?" Mara asked, supporting Ember's weight. "When did you start feeling sick?" "This morning," Ember whispered, their voice barely audible. "After breakfast. Lord Matthias gave me special blood. Said it would make me stronger." They doubled over, retching violently. Ice flooded Mara's veins. Lord Matthias, one of the inner circle vampires who'd threatened her in the alley. If he'd given Ember something. "We need to get you to your father," Mara said urgently, but Ember shook their head weakly. "Can't," they said. "They said if I got sick, it meant someone was trying to poison me. They said it was probably someone who pretended to care but really wanted to hurt me." The pieces clicked together in Mara's mind with horrifying clarity. This wasn't just poisoning, it was a setup. The inner circle was using Ember as bait to destroy her relationship with Silas. But before she could explain, angry voices erupted outside the storage room. "There she is." Agent Morrison's voice cut through the night air. "Mara Sullivan, you're under arrest for attempted murder of a vampire heir." The door burst open, revealing a crowd of FAD agents, human police, and what looked like half the neighborhood. Behind them, Mara could see the twisted faces of an angry mob. Humans who'd lived in fear of vampires their entire lives and finally had someone to blame for their suffering. "Step away from the child," Agent Kelly shouted, his weapon drawn. "We know what you've done." "I haven't done anything," Mara protested, but even as the words left her mouth, she realized how it looked. She was holding a dying vampire child, alone in a secret room, with no witnesses to her innocence. "We have evidence," Morrison sneered, pulling out a small glass vial. "This was found in your old workshop ruins. Concentrated silver nitrate, lethal to vampires when administered in blood." He held up a second item, a syringe. "Your fingerprints are all over it." "That's impossible," Mara breathed, but her heart was sinking. The inner circle had planned this perfectly. They'd poisoned Ember with something that would cause symptoms, planted evidence in her burned workshop, and timed it to maximize the damage to her reputation. "She's been planning this all along," someone shouted from the crowd. "Vampire sympathizer my ass. She's been trying to kill them from the inside." "Murderer," another voice called. "She used that poor child to get close to their leader." Ember tried to speak, tried to defend her, but their voice was too weak and the crowd was too loud. Rough hands seized Mara's arms, dragging her away from the child despite her struggles. "No," she cried out. "Ember needs help. Please, whatever you think I've done, don't let them die because of it." But her pleas fell on deaf ears. The mob's bloodlust was up, and they'd found their perfect scapegoat. A human who dared to cross species lines and now appeared to be exactly the monster they'd always expected her to be. As they dragged her toward the waiting police van, Mara caught sight of a familiar figure standing at the edge of the crowd. Silas had arrived, his face a mask of controlled fury as he surveyed the chaos. Their eyes met across the mob, and she saw the moment when doubt crept into his expression. Here was his heir, dying in agony. Here was the human he'd been protecting, covered in evidence of guilt. Here were witnesses claiming she betrayed his trust in the most vicious way possible. "Silas," she called out desperately. "It's a trap. The inner circle, they did this to frame me. You have to believe me." But even as she spoke, she could see him wavering. 300 years of vampire politics had taught him that trust was a luxury that got people killed. The evidence looked damning. The timing was perfect. And his child was dying while the human he'd grown to care for stood accused of the crime. Lady Evangeline Ashworth materialized beside him, her silver hair gleaming in the streetlights. "I'm sorry you had to see this, my lord," she said with poisonous sympathy. "We tried to warn you about human nature, but you wouldn't listen. Now look what her treachery has cost us." Mara watched in horror as Silas's expression hardened. The warmth that had been growing between them over the past weeks drained from his red eyes, replaced by the cold calculation of an alpha vampire protecting his bloodline. "Please," Mara whispered as the agents forced her into the van. "Don't let them win. Don't let Ember die because of their games." The van doors slammed shut, cutting off her view of the crowd. Through the small window, she caught one last glimpse of Silas standing motionless in the street, torn between the evidence of his eyes and the instincts of his heart. As they drove toward what she was certain would be her execution, Mara realized that the inner circle had achieved something even more devastating than her death. They destroyed the fragile trust between her and Silas, turning them against each other at the moment when they needed each other most. And somewhere in the vampire compound, Ember was dying while the real killers celebrated their victory. The execution platform had been erected in the center of New Salem's main square, a grim wooden structure that served as a stark reminder of the city's brutal justice system. Dawn was breaking over the gathered crowd, hundreds of humans who had come to witness what they believed would be the righteous killing of a vampire collaborator. Mara stood on the platform with her hands bound behind her back, flanked by grim-faced Ephid agents. The past 48 hours in detention had been a nightmare of accusations and interrogations, but she'd maintained her innocence even as the evidence mounted against her. Below, the crowd bayed for blood with the kind of vicious enthusiasm that made her stomach turn. These were her neighbors, people she'd lived among for years, and they were screaming for her death with genuine hatred in their voices. "Citizens of New Salem," Agent Morrison's voice boomed across the square. "We gather today to witness justice for crimes against both human and vampire law. Mara Sullivan stands accused of attempted murder of a vampire heir, an act that threatens the fragile peace our city depends on." The crowd roared its approval. From her vantage point, Mara could see vampire observers stationed around the square's perimeter, members of various covens who had come to ensure the human authorities followed through on their promise of execution. But she noticed something else. Several of the vampire watchers looked tense, their eyes constantly scanning the crowd as if expecting trouble. Whatever was happening, not all the supernatural community was united behind her death sentence. "Do you have any final words?" Morrison asked, clearly relishing his moment in the spotlight. Mara lifted her chin, her voice carrying clearly across the square. "I'm innocent. I would never harm Ember, or any child. The people who really poisoned them are standing among you, watching you kill the wrong person." A wave of angry shouts rose from the crowd, but Mara pressed on. "When you find out the truth, and you will, remember this moment. Remember how eager you were to believe the worst about someone who only tried to help." Morrison signaled to the executioner, a hooded figure who stepped forward with a silver-bladed axe designed specifically for dealing with supernatural threats, or those accused of working with them. The crowd fell silent in anticipation. That's when the ground began to shake. It started as a low rumble, barely noticeable at first. Then the tremors grew stronger, rattling windows and sending loose stones tumbling from nearby buildings. People in the crowd looked around nervously, confused by the sudden seismic activity. The rumbling became a thunder, and suddenly the source became clear. Lord Silas Blackthorne rode into the square at the head of a small army. Vampire warriors on midnight black horses surrounded the platform, their weapons drawn and their eyes blazing with supernatural fury. But it was Silas himself who commanded every eye, dressed in battle armor that gleamed like liquid shadow. His presence so powerful that even the bravest humans in the crowd stepped back instinctively. "Stop this execution!" His voice boomed across the square with alpha authority that brooked no argument. Agent Morrison stepped forward, his hand on his weapon. "Lord Blackthorne, you have no authority here. This is human justice for human crimes." "Human crimes?" Silas dismounted with fluid grace, his red eyes scanning the platform with predatory focus. "Then perhaps you should have consulted the victim before pronouncing judgment." A gasp rippled through the crowd as a small figure emerged from behind Silas's horse. Ember, still pale but clearly alive and recovering, walked steadily toward the platform. Their platinum hair caught the morning light, and their voice carried with surprising strength. "She didn't hurt me," the child declared, pointing up at Mara. "The kind lady would never hurt anyone. It was Lord Matthias and Lady Evangeline who gave me the poison blood. They said it would make me stronger, but it made me sick instead." The crowd erupted in confused murmurs. Morrison's face went white as the foundation of his case crumbled before his eyes. "The child is obviously confused," he began, but Silas cut him off with a gesture. "Are you calling my heir a liar?" The temperature in the square seemed to drop 10 degrees. Before Morrison could answer, 3 figures stepped out from the crowd of vampire observers. Lady Evangeline Ashworth, Lord Matthias, and their companion from the alley confrontation weeks ago. Their faces showed no guilt, only cold calculation. "The fledgling has been manipulated," Lady Evangeline said smoothly. "Human corruption runs deeper than—" She never finished the sentence. Silas moved faster than human eyes could follow, crossing the distance between them in a heartbeat. His claws extended, and with surgical precision, he drove them through her chest and ripped out her centuries-old heart. Lady Evangeline crumbled to dust before she could even scream. Lord Matthias tried to run, but Silas's loyal warriors were already moving. The ancient vampire made it 3 steps before Captain Darius, Silas's most trusted lieutenant, separated his head from his shoulders with a silver sword. The third conspirator fell to his knees, begging for mercy that would never come. "You poisoned my child," Silas said, his voice carrying absolute judgment. "You framed an innocent woman. You tried to manipulate me into destroying something precious." His eyes blazed brighter. "There is no mercy for traitors who target children." The final execution was swift and final. In the stunned silence that followed, Silas turned to face the crowd of humans and vampires. With deliberate ceremony, he drew a silver dagger and sliced open his palm, letting ancient blood drip onto the platform's wooden boards. "I swear by blood and shadow," he declared, his voice carrying to every corner of the square. "This human saved my heir when she had every reason to turn away. Now I save her as honor demands." His red eyes swept the crowd with unmistakable threat. "She is mine to protect. Harm her, and you answer to me personally." The blood oath hung in the air like a living thing, binding him to his words with supernatural force. As Agent Morrison's trembling hands untied her bonds, Mara realized that everything had changed. She was no longer just a human mechanic caught up in vampire politics. She was under the protection of the most powerful vampire in New Salem, and judging by the way Silas looked at her, that protection came with feelings far deeper than mere obligation. Section 8. A Future Rewritten. 6 months after the Blood Oath, New Salem was becoming a city that neither humans nor vampires recognized. The changes had started slowly. New laws governing interspecies relations, established trade agreements that benefited both communities, and most importantly, a council system where human and vampire representatives worked together to solve problems instead of creating them. Much of the progress could be traced back to quiet conversations held in a rebuilt workshop on Copper Street, where a human mechanic and a vampire lord discuss policy over cups of tea and mechanical projects. "The housing initiative is working better than expected," Mara said, adjusting the gears on a new street lighting system she designed. The lamps would burn brighter and longer than traditional gas lights, making the streets safer for humans while providing the subtle illumination vampires preferred. Silas watched her work with the same fascination he'd shown for months. Her hands were steady and sure, creating order from chaos with an efficiency that impressed him more than centuries of vampire politics ever had. "The mixed patrols are helping too," he replied, referring to the new system where human police officers worked alongside vampire enforcers. "Crime is down 40% in both districts." Mara smiled, tightening a final bolt. Amazing what people can accomplish when they stop assuming the worst about each other. The workshop around them hummed with activity. Orders poured in from both human and vampire clients. Everything from traditional clockwork repairs to specialized mechanical devices that served supernatural needs. 3 human apprentices worked alongside 2 young vampires, sharing techniques and perspectives that created innovations neither species could have achieved alone. But the most dramatic change was in the relationship between the workshop's owner and her most frequent visitor. Silas no longer hid his interest or made excuses for his presence. He courted Mara openly and deliberately, bringing her flowers that bloomed only in moonlight, commissioning mechanical sculptures that told stories of their growing love, and ensuring that anyone with eyes could see the alpha vampire of New Salem was completely devoted to a human woman. "The Textile Guild wants to meet next week about the new looms," Mara said, wiping her hands on her work apron. "Apparently, the vampire seamstresses have techniques that could revolutionize their production. And the Metalworkers Union is interested in vampire-forged steel," Silas added. "It seems our species have more to offer each other than anyone imagined." Their eyes met across the workshop, and the warmth that passed between them could have powered the new street lamps for a week. What had started as gratitude and grown into attraction had deepened into something profound. A love that was reshaping not just their lives, but their entire world. A familiar melody drifted through the workshop as Ember appeared in the doorway, no longer the terrified child who had stumbled into Mara's life with a broken toy. They moved with growing confidence, dressed in clothes that blended human and vampire fashion, carrying something carefully wrapped in silk. "Mara," Ember said, their voice bright with excitement, "I made something for you." They unwrapped the silk to reveal a mechanical bird, even more intricate than Mr. Clockwork. This one was larger, crafted from silver and copper, with delicate filigree work that caught the lamplight like captured stars. But the most remarkable feature was its song. When Ember wound the key, it played a melody that seemed to blend human lullabies with vampire harmonies, creating something entirely new and beautiful. "I used the techniques you taught me," Ember explained, beaming with pride, "and some vampire metalworking that Papa Silas showed me. I wanted to give it to you because," they paused, suddenly shy, "because you're the first person who ever made me feel safe. The first person who ever loved me just for being me." Mara knelt down and accepted the gift with trembling hands, her throat tight with emotion. "Ember, this is beautiful. Thank you." The child looked up at her with those 2 old eyes that had seen so much pain and found so much healing. "Can I call you Mother?" they whispered. "Not instead of my birth father's memory, but as well as." Tears spilled down Mara's cheeks as she pulled Ember into a fierce embrace. "Yes," she whispered back. "I would be honored to be your mother." Silas moved to stand beside them, his large hand coming to rest gently on Mara's shoulder. The 3 of them, vampire lord, human mechanic, and healing child, formed a picture that would have been impossible just months ago. "You know," Silas said quietly, his voice rich with emotion. "When I first met you, I thought you were just a kind woman who helped a lost child." Mara looked up at him, still holding Ember close. "And now?" He reached down and clasped her free hand in his, their fingers interlacing with perfect familiarity. "Now I know the truth. You didn't just save my heir that night, Mara. You saved my bloodline from becoming something cold and empty." His red eyes gleamed with love and certainty. "You brought light into our darkness. You showed us what we could become." He lifted their joined hands and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "You saved my bloodline," he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute truth. "Now you are part of it. Forever." Outside, the sun was setting over New Salem, painting the sky in shades of hope and possibility. In the distance, the mixed species patrols began their evening rounds, protecting a city where humans and vampires were learning to build something better together. And in a small workshop on Copper Street, a family born from impossible circumstances celebrated the love that had transformed their world.